Hello, this is Rue. I'm going to be talking to you today about the historical uses of poisons. You must forgive any of my mispronunciations. I've been feral for 18 months and not really good at that whole speaking out loud thing. So bear with me, and I appreciate that. So hi. We will open with warning. The following class contains information that is not sanctioned by any crown. Additionally, no one should use anything that they learn in this class to poison people in real life. The first reason is hospital and emergency facilities are much enhanced compared to even the first half of the 20th century. Killing someone with a medieval style poison is nearly impossible in this day and age. Second reason, thanks to modern technology, getting away with it in today's forensic capabilities is not happening. So don't do this. All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Only the dose makes a thing not a poison. And this was said by Paracelsus in the 1500s. There are three types of known natural substances that will kill you: plants, rocks, and animals. Of those substances, a limited amount of them were used to purposely poison a human victim for gain or revenge. Battles and even countries have been won and lost on toxins. Chemical warfare has been around for thousands of years. A Sumerian tablet dating to 2500 BC, found in the 1850s, documents the use of poisons as a clandestine way for ridding oneself of an enemy. They've also found cuneiforms confirming that the Sumerians worshipped a deity known as Gula, who not only was the goddess of healing and mistress of charms and spells, but the controller of noxious poisons. Chinese writings as far back as 1000 BC have recipes for making irritating smokes for use in war. The earliest records of Egypt indicate that the pharaoh Menes studied toxic plants and venoms. Both the Indian texts, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, have discourses on using poison weapons, and the Manusmriti forbids them as unjust. However, around 600 BC, an Indian surgeon and sage named Sushruta defined the stages of slow poisoning and suggested antidotes in his Sushruta Samhita. Instructions for detecting poisons were given in the Veda because, and I quote, "the enemies of the Raja, bad women, and ungrateful servants sometimes mix poison with the food." Chanakya, who lived from 350 to 283 BC, believed to be Kautilya, was advisor to the first Maurya emperor Chandragupta, and in his treaty, the Arthashastra, he suggested that using seduction, secret weapons, and poison were the best ways to gain in politics. He produced elaborate methods for detecting these poisons and discussed many possible methods for assassinations, including the Vish Kanya, who were the young women reportedly used as assassins, often against powerful enemies during the Mauryan Empire. Although the legend goes that their blood was purportedly poisonous to other humans, it was more likely that these women were simply employed to distract a gentleman while poisoning their drink. The legend goes that Chanakya fed his emperor small bits of poisons to make him immune as well, but in a shared meal with his very pregnant wife, the woman was killed, and the emperor's child, Bindusara, was removed from the dying woman and survived. In the end, Chanakya felt guilt for the death of the queen and starved himself in Jain tradition. The concept of making oneself immune to poison has cropped up in folklore and in fiction stories ever since, but it has some merit. Snake handlers will actually gain immunity to snake venom by tattooing themselves with the poison. And certain naturally occurring toxins in nature are successfully defeated in this practice, called Mithridatism, after another royal practitioner. Nicander of Colophon, personal attendant to Attalus III, king of Pergamum, wrote two poems, the Theriaca and the Alexipharmaca, in the 2nd century BC, and both were about poisons. Theriaca was 1,000 lines of poisonous animals, plants, and remedies, and the Alexipharmaca was 600 lines about generic poisons, cures, and antidotes. His preferred antidote was developed from viper parts seasoned with aromatic herbs and fruits. And then there's Rome. It wasn't until the Mediterranean culture started to rise to prominence that the act of poisoning your enemies became an art. The people of the civilized society learned how to introduce poisons for executions, assassinations, suicide, and murder. As early as 550 BC, rivals from every class were commonly executing one another with poisoned food and drink. Between the 4th century BC and the 3rd century, the amount of deaths caused by poisoning was so great it was practically a meme. There are several instances of mass poisonings in earlier times, which coincided with epidemics and wars in the region. Examples include the so-called mass suicide of the Capuans in 211 BC and the death of the Median queens, Sosthenisba, in 203 BC. Then at the time of the Julio-Claudian emperors, there is a real fashion to be all involved with poisons. There were 3 women poisoners mentioned by various writers, Canidia, Martina, and Locusta. For assassinations, the Romans focused mainly on plant toxins in early times, such as belladonna, henbane, datura, deadly nightshade, mandrake, aconitum, hemlock, hellebore, autumn crocuses, yew extract, and opium. Animal poisons were not well studied or often used in homicides in ancient Rome, but they knew about the cantheridine extracts as well as poisonous insects, snakes, spiders, fish, and scorpions. Mineral poisons like salts of lead, mercury, copper, arsenic, and antimony were also known, but they hadn't been fine-tuned to specific poisonings and were more often seen in grand-scale war tactics. The fumes in lead, silver, and gold mines were recognized as toxic, and that's how they got rid of a lot of their prisoners. Very rarely are specific poisons ever mentioned, but there are some. Canidia used hemlock and honey, and Seneca drank the hemlock. Ovid called aconite, or the mother-in-law's poison. Ovid calls aconite the mother-in-law's poison, and the British king Catuvolcus committed suicide with a yew extract. Claudius died after eating poisoned mushrooms. Likely aconite was used, they believe. The situation got so out of control that the Lex Cornelia was established in 82 BC, and this was the first law specifically against poisons, written by Lucius Cornelius Sulla. So because of the legends and such, and people being very against these poisons, earlier records are lost to time. And there's very little documentation of early poisonings. But there are some written down records that paint a larger history as to the use of poisons. The Egyptians understood well enough about toxins and believed that none could withstand them. Legends say that Ra succumbed to the effects of a snake bite, and Horus suffered death from the sting of a scorpion. The Ebers Papyrus from 1550 BC is an Egyptian treatise on medicine and describes the use of several well-known toxins, although a general cause and effect regarding poisonous substance seems to be missing. The Egyptians recognized murder by toxins. The papyrus mentions the penalty of the peach, which involves forcing criminals to ingest the distillate from the pits of peaches containing cyanide compounds. If the victim died, he was guilty. This concept of justice continued on through Greek and Roman culture. Philon of Athens, an architect in 4th century BC, created the Polonium Romanorum antidote, which consisted of several herbs like spikenard, henbane, and pyrethrum, among others. Diocles of Carystus was a student of Aristotle, and he wrote the Rhizotomicon, considered to be the first work on botany, and the 3rd book of this deals exclusively with toxins from plants. Zopyrus of Alexandria in the 1st century BC invented an antidote for poison consisting of 30 to 50 ingredients, and he was a surgeon and recommended the formula to both the Ptolemies and Mithridates. So Mithridates VI, Eupator of Pontius, king of Tim, who lived from around 114 to 63 BC, he lived in constant fear of being assassinated by poison. His father had been poisoned, likely by his mother. It is also said that he consumed non-lethal levels of various poisons to build up immunity, so much so that when he finally attempted suicide, he couldn't poison himself. In his position of power, he tested a number of poisons on criminals facing execution and checked to see if there was possible antidotes. He says he discovered a formula combining small portions of dozens of the best-known herbal remedies of the time, and he called it Mithridatium. His antidote prescriptions and notes were taken by the Romans after his defeat by Pompey. Once translated into Latin, Pliny the Elder in the 1st century included it in his published works, along with descriptions of over 7,000 different poisons, adding his own recipe for Mithridatium using the blood of a duck. He had this to say, however, in his Natural History 29. The Mithridatic antidote is composed of 54 ingredients, no 2 of which having the same weight, while some are prescribed 1/60th part of 1 denarius. Which of the gods, in the name of truth, fixed these absurd proportions? No human brain could have been sharp enough. It is plainly a showy parade of the art. Aulus Cornelius Celsus provides a version of the antidote in his De Medicina. And then the ingredients were ground up, mixed with honey, and then distributed in almond-sized amounts in wine when needed. And I have the list here, and it's just ridiculously small amounts, and there's tons of them. And you can get this whole class by contacting me, and I'll have the email later. There were others who discussed poisons and antidotes. Dioscorides in 40 to 90 classified poisons in his Materia Medica. He wrote, poison prophylaxis is difficult because those who work secretly with poisons make sure that even the most experienced are deceived. Galen, a Greek in the Roman Empire from 129 to about 200, also made an antidote that he called nut theriac, and that consisted of plant parts and salt mixed with porridge. The Anapigraphus, today a fragment of a 3rd century treaty, contains information about an earlier late Roman Egypt alchemist named Agathodamon, who developed a fiery poison likely made from arsenic trioxide. His discoveries regarding poison were referred to later in the records of poisoning and murder. In the Middle East, a compound poison of minced ingredients was most effectively administered in the highly spiced food of the region. I have here 3 recipes taken from the Book of Poisons by Ibn Washia, written in the 9th century, but I'll only read 2. Recipe 1. Using 1 part minim, which is white lead, 1 part litharge, which is peroxide of lead, 1/10 part oleander leaf, and 1/10 part black hellebore. Cook the ingredients with sesame oil and rose water. This mixture is fatal in about 1 day. Recipe 2. Using 1 mouse, stung to death by scorpions, pulverized euphorbium, sponge in its leaf, hellebore, apopanax, and mustard. Combine all the ingredients in a lead crucible, cover tightly, and bury in a dung heap for a week, 2 weeks. Then grind all ingredients well, being sure to reduce the mouse bones to a fine powder. Add a little saffron. This is supposed to kill in a day or 2. In the Middle Ages, the works of the ancient scholars formed the basis for most knowledge of poisonous plants, including the Book of Venoms, written by the Magister Santes de Ordoñez in 1424. Such treaties were comprehensive but often confusing due to the use of so many different names for the same plants, a problem that still exists to this day, since many of the plants share the same common names. In Italy, poisoning became so prominent in the 16th century that schools were established in Venice and Rome. In 1589, the Napoleoni Magio Naturalis was published, written by Giovanni Battista Porta. In it was described several methods of poisoning, particularly via wine. Porta offered his own recipe called Venenum Lupinum, which contained aconite, yew seeds, caustic lime, arsenic, bitter almonds, and powdered glass. Mixed with honey, it was formed into pills, quote, the size of walnuts. So several civilizations actually learned how to create poisonous gases and irritants to bring their enemies down low. 4,000 years ago, the Indian dynasties were using smoke screens, toxic sleep-inducing fumes, and incendiary devices in battle. The Chinese were famous for using chemicals to make poisonous smoke. Chinese writings from 1000 BC discussed poisonous, noxious, and irritating vapors for war, including arsenic vapors that they called the soul-hunting fog. They would pump the smoke into the tunnels to reach their enemy. A search of early records revealed that pepper has been used at various times during the past 2,500 years as a weapon. The Chinese used what they called stink pots. They consisted of pepper burned in oil that caused an irritating and suffocating smoke. Chinese and also developed stink bombs of poisonous smoke and shrapnel, along with a chemical mortar that fired cast iron stink shells. The Indian schools of the martial arts, such as the Kalari Payat, the Vashamushti, the Marman, and the Kahatsi, forefather of karate, also were among those who applied various forms of pepper as combative tools. The Japanese also used finely ground powder. They put it into rice paper pouches, and they would throw it into the faces of their enemies to temporarily blind them. During the Peloponnesian War at the siege of Plataea in 428 BC, Sparta burned wood soaked in pitch and sulfur under the walls to create a toxic, panic-inducing smoke. They did it again at Delium in 424 BC. Around 200 BC, the inhabitants of Ambracia in Epirus also used toxic smoke to keep the Romans from breaching their walls. The Romans had formations of attack dogs that would carry the pots of burning sulfur and resin into battle. In what could be considered chemical attacks or biological warfares, the Romans were actually also known for catapulting bees at their enemy. And the cannibal of Carthage took this a step further during the Punic War and hurled pots of snakes at the Roman ships during a sea battle in 184 BC. Between 82 and 72 BC, Romans used a toxic smoke that caused blindness and choking to defeat the Spanish Cherokatanes in only 2 days. So they actually have this huge thing about called Greek fire. Ingredients, we think, include resin, pitch, sulfur, naphtha or petroleum, quicklime, and saltpeter. Invented by Callinicos or Callinus, who arrived in Constantinople in 668, fleeing Syria, the Byzantines were already siphoning naphtha through the water pistols and pumps, but Callinus pumped the pressurized fuel through bronze cannons, and he ignited the Muslim ships. During the 15th century, the Christians used arsenic smoke against invading Turks at the siege of Delium. A writer at the time who witnessed the results commented that such a murderous weapon should never be used by Christians against each other, but on the heretics, it's okay. Leonardo da Vinci proposed a machine in the 15th century that fired shells containing powdered sulfur, arsenic, and verdigris, which is copper acetate, and he would aim it at the ships, and the poisons would attack the lungs of anybody in the vicinity. In the 1600s, incendiary shells filled with sulfur, tallow, rosin, turpentine, saltpeter, and antimony were also used to start fires in sieges. The toxic smoke projectiles are also seen in the 30 Years' War, which was from 1618 to 1648. During the attack on Groningen in 1672, the Bishop of Munster, Christoph Bernhard van Galen, tried several types of devices containing belladonna alkaloids. And while they might not have worked, it led to the first signed agreement to suspend attacks of chemical warfare. So not all uses of toxins in historic times were designed to be lethal. Toxins were used to knock out or otherwise incapacitate enemies in order to subdue them later. This could be in the form of poisoning the food or water source, or even sharing narcotic or digestive toxins with a group of people in good faith and then slaughtering them all once they were rendered harmless. In the first sacred war of 590 BC, Greece prepared to lay siege to the fortified city of Cura, and Solon of Athens poisoned the city's water supply with hellebore roots to give them all diarrhea. The Carthaginians left mandrake to rot in wine in order to knock out their enemies in 200 BC. Mithridates VI, Epaminondas, was pressed to war against the Roman leader Pompey, so he retreated past the shores of the Black Sea and then purchased large pots of locally made honey and left them where they could be found by the Roman soldiers. 3 squadrons became violently ill because the local honey was often contaminated by pollen from rhododendrons, which is poisonous. If you're not used to it. The following morning, Mithridates' armies annihilated the sick troops. About 4,500 years ago, the Koyak and Wiros tribes of the central Russian steppes conducted what might be the first experiments in stimulating violence through the intentional application of drugs. They derived from the Amanita muscaria mushroom, a drug that reduced the warrior's anxiety and fear while increasing strength, stamina, mental acuity, and the ability to withstand pain. The shamans hit upon the unique method of increasing potency. The mushroom was first fed to the reindeer, and then the soldiers drank the animal's urine on the eve of battle. They are not the only ones. It is said that the Vikings also ingested chemical stimulants via deer urine to create the berserker warriors. Until 1800 AD, some Scandinavian historians believed that the Viking berserkers ingested the Amanita muscaria mushroom before going into battle, which is likely not true, but the Icelandic name for fly agaric contains the word berserk in it. It is more likely that something else was used because Amanita muscaria doesn't cause berserk behavior. So then you have poison arrows. Poisonous arrows have been used since antiquity in nearly every continent with the possible exception of Australia and New Zealand. The oldest evidence comes from ancient Egypt as far back as 2181 BC. Aristotle mentioned that the Scythians used arrow poison, starting with a venomous snake that was then left to rot. Poison arrows are also mentioned in the Book of Job. Poison arrows are divided here in three major groups. You have African arrows, American arrows, and Eurasian arrows. Despite the differences in species, there are some similarities in style. Generally, the poison was never smeared on the tip, but placed behind the tip so penetration through skin and fur wouldn't wipe off the poison. Sometimes the poison was inserted into a hollow shaft. African arrow poisons are mostly made up of cardiac poisons. Most techniques here use more than one component. There's about 250 different species that have been used in Africa, and the cacti euphorbium is consistently used as a glue to hold the poison on the shaft or in the shaft. Only the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert use animal extracts alone. Other Bushmen mix venom with plants or use plants alone. There's a number of plants that have been used, including Acacanthera, Adenium, Strophanthus, Cassia, Pelagaria, Euphorbia, and Strychnos. By the early 20th century, arsenic was often used, but by the mid-century, the cyanide became quite popular. In South America, the toxins are almost all respiratory paralyzers, also known as curare. Each tribe has its own curare recipe, but most implement the bark of the moonseed family members mixed with other unspecified substances, sometimes up to 30 of them. Tube curare comes from the West Amazon and is stored in bamboo tubes, and it's made from the plant Chondrodendron tomentosum. From the Eastern Amazon is a calabash curare stored in small gourds, and lastly there is pot curare that is stored in clay pots. Both calabash and pot curares use strychnos. When it comes to the respiratory paralyzing effects of chondrodendron, it can take up to 15 darts to take down a human, so don't let any movie tell you otherwise. The strength of the batch of curare can be tested a number of ways, like counting how many times a frog can jump after being pricked, or how many trees a monkey can leap to after being hit. 1 tree curare is very potent. 3 tree curares can be used to take down live animals for captivity. In North America, the principal ingredient for creating poison stone-tipped arrows is the yellow lichen Avernia, which grows on pine and fir trees in the mountains. The arrow points were embedded in masses of wet lichen and allowed to remain there for up to a year. Sometimes rattlesnake venom was sometimes added. Machineal, used in Central America around the Caribbean, was used by Caribs as an arrow poison, watering hole poison, and to tie criminals to overnight as a way of torture, because it would eat away the flesh. The leaves of the shrub called the pallid hop tree were made into an arrow poison by the Havasupai tribe. The third region of arrow poisons is made up of Asia and Europe, and they used all cardiac poisons with tectonic side effects, spasms. The most well-known is aconite, also known as monkshood or wolf's bane. This toxin was even found in arrow and spear poisons of the Alaskan Peninsula, likely from their Asiatic ancestors, and was used to hunt sea lions and whales. So, in 82 BC, the first law against poisoning was established in Rome, called the Lex Cornea de Sicarius et Beneficius, concerning assassins and sorcerers. It not only condemned poisoning, but added provisions for those who made, sold, bought, possessed, or gave poisons for the act of poisoning. For obvious reasons, many assassins of the past are not well known. Most did not make contract killing their chosen career. There are a few, however, that made history as being poisonous. So Medea. sorceress and priestess of Hecate and the wife of Jason in the Greek mythos, was said to use meadow saffron, Colchicum autumnale, as a poison. She not only knew poisons, but other potions that helped her husband get to the golden fleece. Her aunt Circe used poisons and potions as well, and Odysseus is warned to use the holy herb called moly as an antidote to Circe's pig transformation spell. Borgias was a eunuch in Persia around 330 BC who manipulated his way to becoming the chief minister to Artaxerxes III. He ended up killing the king and the entire royal family except for the weakest son, Arsus, who he then elevated as the new king. When Arsus attempted to remove Borgias, the eunuch poisoned him as well and manipulated the cousin of Arsus to move on to the throne as Darius III. Darius was a little smarter than his predecessors, and when Borgias tried to assassinate him, Darius forced Borgias to drink the poison himself. Borgias may have organized other killings because, according to Plutarch, Darius received an angry letter from Alexander the Great accusing Borgias of organizing the death of Alexander's father, Philip II. Locusta was a notorious poisoner, possibly hired by Agrippina the Younger in 54 to poison Claudius. He was killed eating mushrooms that were poisoned with another substance, likely aconitum. Even if she was not responsible for his death, there is evidence that poison was her profession, because in 55, she was convicted of a different assassination, but Nero bailed her out and supposedly used her to kill Britannicus. The empire paid her with estates, and Locusta is documented as having students and teaching others the art of toxicology, according to later biographies. She also had the state's permission to investigate poisonings and report on them. She was condemned to die by the Emperor Galba around 69, but we don't know if she actually was successfully killed. Two other women of the same age were also considered poisoners by profession. Canidia, discussed by Horace as preferring a hemlock and honey mixture, and a Martina, about which less is said. Cleopatra was said to be an expert mixer of poisoners. In her brews, she drew upon ancient tradition, would describe the effectiveness of various poisons in great detail. Cleopatra regularly tested poisons on slaves, and Mark Antony feared her so much that unless a taster was present, he would not eat with her. Cleopatra regarded this as an insult. At the banquet, she plucked a flower from the garland that was in her hair, threw it into Mark Antony's wine cup, and asked him to drink the wine as a sign of his love. Antony knew a taster had already drunk from the wine cup, so he started to drink, but Cleopatra seized the cup from Antony, gave the prisoner the cup to drink, and he dropped dead. She turned to Mark Antony and said, "I poisoned the blossoms. I only wanted to show you that if I wanted to, I could kill you despite your taster." The Borgias. The Borgias have been synonymous with treachery and assassinations. In The Prince, Machiavelli uses Cesare Borgia to describe the dangers of acquiring a principality by virtue of another. It is said that the Borgias were adept poisoners, particularly Lucretia, and the stories surrounding their exploits have become legendary. Cesare and Lucretia were the illegitimate children of the man who became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. They were believed to dispatch many of their enemies with a poison called La Cantarella, which is supposed to be made of copper, arsenic, and phosphorus, following the trends of that time. The poor quality of records makes the actual assassin questionable, but Cesare is the most likely suspect. New information has suggested that Lucretia, although strong-willed and sexually passionate, never actually murdered anyone. In Venice during the 1500s, there existed a group of alchemists called the Council of Ten, and they met regularly to arrange poisons for the state. Their preserved written records, which are available online, proved that they would plan, vote on, and carry out the execution of any person for a significant sum of money. Their list of poisons include corrosive sublimate, white arsenic, arsenic trisulfide, and arsenic trichloride. In 1543, a mercenary assassin named John of Ragusa approached the council with a boast that he could remove any person from society. Whether they hired him or not is unknown. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, used her position of power to test toxins on the poor and the sick, documenting her findings. In the 17th century England, there were several failed attempts to poison Queen Elizabeth, one with opium. Elizabeth, whose mother, Anne Boleyn, had once tried to poison her father, took action against possible poisonings by having her food tasted, her clothing checked for poisons, and also by being Mithridatized. Giulia Tofana was a professional Italian poisoner in the mid-1600s, and she invented aqua tofana, a colorless, tasteless liquid consisting mostly of arsenic, lead, and possibly belladonna. It was easily mixed with water or wine. It is unknown whether she learned her craft from her mother or from the numerous apothecaries she frequented, but she developed her own poisons for her profession. Under torture, she confessed to killing 600 men with her poisons in Rome alone between 1633 and 1651. She has said that she sold her poisons to women trapped in difficult marriages. She was executed in 1659 with her daughter and several of her lovers. Exili was an Italian chemist and poisoner in the 1600s who may have been salaried at Rome for Olympia Matachina, sister-in-law to Pope Innocent X. He also frequented the courts of Queen Christina of Sweden. He was imprisoned in the Bastille for a time, where Godin de Secroy claimed to have met him, and it is said that he passed the recipe of aqua tofana from the Italian to his lover, Madame de Brinvilliers. So the Marquise de Brinvilliers, the Marquess de Brinvilliers, from 1630 to 1676, she was a poisoner who worked with the Saint Croix to poison a number of people, including her father, 2 brothers, and a sister for her inheritance. She attempted to poison her children's tutor, who was intelligent enough to save himself and other targets. She poisoned her own daughter for, quote, being stupid, but ended up changing her mind and providing the antidote. St. Croix betrayed her at his death, and after a run through England and Netherlands, she was captured and put to death. It is believed that in her confession that she broke open what is now called the poison affair, although it might be that these were near simultaneous incidences. Catherine de Chay, also known as La Voisin, along with 600 other people, were implicated in an involvement of a secret society of poisoners in France who all called themselves fortune tellers, and they all worked for the aristocracy, and they were killing each other. King Louis XIV himself was a target, although unsuccessful, by his own mistress. So the following are individual substances that have been used for poisoning in known cases in history. In a documented case of assassination by animal toxin, the 4th Greek Cyrenian king Aristylus II was assassinated in 550 BC by his advisor Learchus, who slipped a sea hare into the king's drink. Sea hares are not poisonous. Later, the advisor had to sneak into the king's bedroom and strangle him himself. As for rocks and minerals, hematite, which is a form of iron oxide, has been mined for millennia, coming in black, red, brown, steel, or silver gray. In the red form, it was a pigment known as ochre. In recent times, Egyptians discovered that the ancient Egyptians had recognized and utilized the sharp irritant properties of ochre dust, using it to booby trap an entire sarcophagus. Then there's arsenic. The elemental derivatives were a murder weapon in China, Persia, Greek, and Rome, and particularly among the ruling classes of Renaissance Italy. Because the symptoms are similar to those of cholera, which was common at the time, arsenic poisoning often went undetected. As a means of eliminating unwanted persons in the Middle Ages, the precipitation technique was popular. One of the easiest methods was to soak a candle wick in arsenic. When the candle was lit, the vapors would be deadly. Both Pope Clement VII in 1534 and Emperor Leopold I of Austria in 1705 were said to have been murdered by this method. Although information is spotty, it is known that during the Borgias' lifetime, an interesting church law took effect. The property of a victim of an untimely death could be confiscated by the church. Pope Alexander would invite wealthy cardinals to his house and, after their untimely deaths, confiscated all their property. By the 1800s, arsenic had acquired the name inheritance powder. Emerald green, a pigment frequently used by impressionist painters, is based on arsenic. Alexander and Cesare both suffered poisoning themselves, although the younger Borgia lived while the father did not. The description of the Pope's body seems to indicate what many guessed at in this passage from Burckhardt. Quote, "He looked like a very black man. The mouth was wide open. the nose heavily swollen, the tongue split in two, the parts hanging over the lips, all of which was so horrible that no one would have believed it was the same man. The ambassador of Venice stated, "It was the most loathsome and most monstrous and frightful corpse that has ever been seen. It had neither the form nor the aspect of a human being." The acute minimum lethal dose of arsenic is estimated to be between 70 and 200 milligrams per dose, or 1 milligram per kilogram in one day. Most reported arsenic poisonings are not caused by elemental arsenic, but by one of the arsenic compounds, especially arsenic trioxide, which is approximately 500 times more toxic than the non-lethal pure arsenic. Therefore, pure arsenic has to be altered, especially what legends abound how Cesare Borgia would slaughter and disembowel a pig and then take the entrails and sprinkle them liberally with pure arsenic. The poison checked but did not entirely arrest the ensuing process of putrefaction. After allowing a certain time to elapse, the semi-putrid matter was squeezed out. The juice thus obtained became far more deadly than the arsenic in pure form, but continued to be, quote, just as tasteless. All now depended on the size of the doses, the manner of mixing in, the best way of administering it. Then you have aconite. Aconitum napellus and other species are called monkshood. The plant was known as far back as in Anglo-Saxon times when it was called thung. Thung became the word known for any poisonous plant. Many cultures used it as a weapon by coating their spears and arrowheads with a strong poison. The plant was used for killing panthers, wolves, and other carnivores. The Greeks called it lycotonum or wolfsbane and believed it was the first poison created, made from Hecate by the foams of Cerberus. The aconite was used as arrow poison in primitive Europe, Alaska, and Asia, and on the Greek island of Chios, aconite was used for euthanasia of old and infirm men. It was often used for criminal purposes. Claudius I, emperor of Rome, was poisoned by mushrooms likely laced with aconitum. It was so often used for political assassinations that Trajan banned its cultivation altogether. Anyone caught gardening these flowers risked the penalty of death. Gerard, an herbalist in Queen Elizabeth times, wrote, "There hath been little theretofore set down concerning the virtues of aconite, but much might be said of the hurts that have come thereby." When Hamlet placed Laertes in the duel, Laertes covered his blade with the juices of the monkshood. In a series of recent trials infamous in Japan, 3 women and 1 man were proven to have collected millions of yen in a murder for insurance ring. The women's prepared sweet buns laced with monkshood for their husbands. The trials ended in 2002 and all received prison terms. Aconite's symptoms include cold and pain. Death occurs within 10 minutes to a few hours, and consciousness often continues until the very end. Acocanthera, Acocanthera, is a small tree known as puncture vine and has been used as an arrow poison among local tribes for hunting and warfare in Africa. Called wabain, the poison was identified in the 3rd century BC by Theophrast as the substance Ethiopians smeared on their arrow poisons. The Portuguese found out about it firsthand in 1505 when they stormed Mombasa. It's prepared by building an underground fire pit and keeping the cooking below ground level so as to not let the vapors escape. The fire is kept going for 3 to 4 days, after which the lid is removed. After a day, the precipitate deposited on the bottom is moved to a wooden or leather container with a tight lid. None of the containers can ever be used in the house again and can't even be burned. The bark can also be soaked in water to extract the poison. Death can result in 30 minutes after the entry of poison into a bloodstream, and a lethal injected dose is a little over 2 milligrams per kilogram. Snake venom, or an elephant shrew, is sometimes added in for that extra kick. The poison causes the hair and the nails to fall off. The only treatment is to immediately excise the flesh around the wound. The seeds have been used as homicidal weapons in southern Africa. Murderers will smear sharp objects with the poison juice of Acocanthera and then put them where victims are likely to step. The maned rat will spread this poison on its own fur to make itself poisonous. Then you got belladonna. Atropos was a Greek fate and held a magical blade from which he cut the threads of life when a person moved from the realms of life to the realms of death. Thus, she gave her name to the belladonna, or the deadly nightshade. According to old legends, the plant belonged to the devil, who goes about trimming and tending it at his leisure and can only be diverted from its care one night a year on Walpurgis night, when he's preparing for the witch's Sabbath. The apples of Sodom are held to be related to this plant, and the name belladonna is said to record an old superstition that in certain times this plant will take the form of an enchantress of exceeding loveliness, whom it is dangerous to look upon. Although the more generally accepted view is that the name was bestowed on it because the juice was used by Italian ladies to give their eyes greater brilliancy, the smallest quality having that effect of dilating the pupils of the eyes. It was supposedly the plant that was used to poison the troops of Marcus Antonius during the Parthian Wars. Deadly nightshade was used in Europe regularly in poisonings. 5 to 10 berries will kill a human. It is used by as primitive people as an arrow poison and was common in Rome. Livia and Agrippina both killed off rivals with it. The Romans used the plant as a type of weapon to contaminate their enemies' food reserves. In 184 BC, Hannibal's army used belladonna to induce disorientation in adversaries. According to Buchanan's History of Scotland, when Duncan I was king of Scotland, Macbeth's soldiers poisoned an entire army of Danes with a liquor treated by an infusion of dwale supplied to them during a truce. The invaders were later easily overpowered and murdered in their sleep by the Scots. Cesare Borgia was said to have a fondness for belladonna, and belladonna is the infamous truth serum feared as a method of brainwashing. Minimum lethal dose of an adult human is about 100 milligrams atropine. A child only takes a few milligrams. An oral dose of 10 milligrams of hyoscyamine will take out an adult. So, cyanide. Cyanide is very famous, but easily obtained from bitter almonds, the pits of plums, apricots, and cherries, and the seeds from apples. It is more famous from the stories written about it as opposed to reality. The pigment Prussian blue was only developed in the late 1700s, and there is little evidence of poisoning via cyanide during medieval times. It is clear that the Egyptians understood the peach pits were the focus of some poison, using them to determine justice, and it is likely that the Romans picked up on this even if they didn't understand the mechanism. Datura. Datura happens to be my favorite. The generic name Datura is from the Hindu Datura, derived from the Sanskrit Dahastura, applied to the Indian species as well as to the medieval Arabic, well known to the medieval Arabian physicians under the name Taturia. Extracts of Datura were used by the Central American empires for infanticide and murder. Popular in both European and American herbals in the 16th century, Datura poisoning saw an upsurge in the 1990s and the 2000s as kids tried to find new ways to become high. So they'd smoke this plant. Unfortunately, Datura is more likely to cause psychosis and self-mutilation, meaning that this plant is not to be messed with. And its other name, Jimson Weed, comes from Jamestown, Virginia. Several variants of the legend exist, but essentially British soldiers were sent to quell Bacon's rebellion and accidentally, or possibly on purpose, were consumed Jimson Weed. They spent the next near dozen days incapacitated with hallucinations, and amnesia followed. Datura is also named as part of the Haitian zombie mixture in The Serpent and the Rainbow. It was first called holy fire. Fire because the burning sensations in the extremities experienced by the victims of ergot. It was called holy because of the belief that this was a punishment from God, as victims' toes, fingers, arms, and legs often became blackened and dropped off as a result of gangrene, often resulting in death from infection. In 944 AD in southern France, 40,000 people died from ergotism, and it wasn't until 1670 that a French physician, Dr. Thuillier, put forth the concept that it was not an infectious disease, but possibly due to the consumption of mold-infected rye. It's been said that the ancient empires of Assyria and Persia poisoned the water supply of their enemies with use of rye ergot, but this is not likely to have happened because no one knew that ergot was causing all this damage. However, even accidental poisonings have their place in warfare, because in 1722, ergotism struck down the cavalry of the Tsar Peter the Great on the eve of a battle for the conquest of Turkey, and thus changed the course of history. Hellebore. Mythology states that a poor shepherd was traveling to Bethlehem. He did not have a present for the Christ child, and he could not find any flowers on his travels because it was winter. The shepherd was sad, and he wept. As his tears touched the ground, flowers as beautiful as roses sprung from the ground. The shepherd took these Christmas roses and brought them to the Christ child as his presents. Those pretty Christmas roses you can find in most nurseries and garden centers, and they will kill you in a few hours if you do it right. It was used as a medicine, as a purgative, and by religious folks to drive out evil spirits because it causes sneezing. Given that the major symptom is blistering effects on the mucous membranes, this was not a pretty result, and likely resulted in several deaths on its own. Some historian believes that a lethal overdose of hellebore ended the life of Alexander the Great. Solon's soldiers threw hellebore roots into streams, supplying the drinking water to enemy troops, causing diarrhea. Supposedly, Melampus of Pylos used the milk of goats fed hellebore to save the daughter of the king Argos, who had been driven to a hysterical madness by Dionysus. And in ancient texts, this is why hellebore is sometimes referred to as melampode. Conium maculatum or Cicuta maculata. Of the two closely related species, water hemlock, the second, is considered deadlier than poison hemlock. Nero reportedly poisoned his brother Britannicus with it after testing it on a goat, or he used Locusta. Stories are mixed. Often hemlock is mixed with opium to kill the condemned. It was the state poison of Athens, and the death decreed for Socrates, according to accounts by Plato. Despite being such a highly fatal plant, it seems that there is little documentation of its use in assassinations anytime after ancient Rome, and almost all poisonings, aside of the above two examples, have been accidental. Henbane. Albertus Magnus attributed the effects of henbane to the influence of the planet Jupiter, and he named it Acheronus. Warriors in Greece and Gaul would poison their javelins with the juice of henbane. It is said the dead in Hades were crowned with henbane, and the ghost from Hamlet is supposedly killed by having henbane poured in his ear. It is said that the scent of the plant produced giddiness and was often included in rituals to create hallucinations. However, in even the most severe cases, the effects of the poisoning can be recovered from, as found out by science today. So although effects can take weeks to dissipate and short-term memory loss is one of the key symptoms, you'll live. Therefore, it is believed that Shakespeare meant another plant when he wrote, "with juice of cursed Hebenon." In 1881, members of a railway surveying expedition crossing Tuareg territory in North Africa ate dried dates that were deliberately contaminated with a relative of this plant by tribesmen, and they were waylaid for a while. Mandragora, mandrake, related to belladonna but found further south in Europe and along the Levant. The mandragora is considered one of the oldest narcotics. Among the Anglo-Saxons, it was used against demons. The plant was fabled to grow under the gallows of murderers, and it was believed to be deaf to dig it up. It is said to utter such a shriek and terrible groans that none could hear it and live. It was held, therefore, that one should tie a dog to it for that purpose. Drawing it out, the dog would certainly perish, and the man will be able to take it out later. In terms of deliberate misuse, a legend holds that it was mandrake used to poison Mark Antonius's troops, and Marharbal in 200 BC was said to have left several amphoras of wine laced with mandrake for his enemies to find. And when the enemy was immobilized, he returned with his men and killed them. However, use as a mass poisoning tool seems less likely because mandrake roots have later become such a sacred item and so rare that they're even passed down from generation to generation as a family talisman. So it doesn't seem likely any of the legends about deliberate poisoning with mandrake are true. Then you have oleander. Oleander it's been recorded that many of Alexander the Great's soldiers died from using oleander twigs to barbecue meat. The plant is so bitter that its use in assassinations and executions have been minimal, but thankfully, considering that this is actually considered one of the most deadly plants in the world, and poisonings still occur with alarming frequency to this day. Opium. The ancient Greeks portrayed the divinities Hypnos, Nyx, and Thanatos wreathed in poppies and carrying poppies in their hands. Often used as a carrier for far more dangerous drugs, there's a story of an assassination attempt made on Queen Elizabeth where opium was smeared on the pommel of her saddle in order so that she get dizzy and fall off. In adults, most opium deaths are motivated by suicide, beginning in the Aegean Islands as a form of euthanasia with hemlock for a painless death. Opium was often used as a narcotic knockout drug to facilitate other crimes like robbery or rape. Between 1837 and 1838, of 543 cases of poisoning in England and Wales, at least 200 involved opium or opium derivatives, and a fifth of those cases involved the overdose of children by parents and nursemaids. Rosary peas, Abrus precatorius. The plant is known in scientific communities, Abrus precatorius, and has been sold as jewelry beads throughout the world, called jaquirity beans or rosary peas. However, this plant is so poisonous that the sharpened seeds have been used as a murder weapon in India. Jewelry makers have died, accidentally pricking their finger while trying to string these beads together. The poison is known as abrin, which is chemically similar to robin or ricin. Needles poisoned with the plants have been used by assassins, according to a document written in 1875. The Center for Disease Control in the United States has put together a treatment plan in the event that someone develops a way to use abrin as a biological weapon. And lastly, we have yew. Artemis was said to dip her arrows in the juice of the yew foliage to execute wayward humans and nymphs. The ancient Celts used extracts of yew from bark and needles as arrow and spear poison. As most archers know, yew is the choice wood for a longbow and has been associated with Europeans for thousands of years. They can live that long too and are often found in cemeteries. A wine from a hip flask made of yew was said by Pliny to poison travelers. Yew has been used as a poison as early as 200 BC, and it was also used for suicide, although according to the suicide website that I found, it's considered a nasty death and you don't want to do it. The Celtic chieftain Catavolcus in 53 BC used it to avoid becoming a Roman slave. So that's it for the class. And what I can do is I can put up here my email address. And if you email me and say, I love this, I would like a copy of this class, you will get a copy of this class verbatim, which as you could tell, I was reading from it. And I will just send it to you. And it's got some extra bits that I tend to skip over in most cases. So let me see. Firewater Pro. Look, it's backwards. I can't write it backwards. So it's firewaterpro@gmail.com. And thank you so much. Take care.